The pounding shook the walls like thunder trapped inside wood and plaster, dragging Isolde from the deepest sleep she'd known in months. She lurched upright from the kitchen chair, scattering dried lavender across the stone floor, her heart slamming against her ribs before her mind could catch up with her body. The pounding came again. 3 heavy strikes against the front door, deliberate and urgent, the kind of knocking that belonged to creditors, or soldiers, or men who brought news no one wanted to hear. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the cold hearth and moved through the darkened hallway, bare feet silent on worn floorboards. Rain hammered the windows. Lightning split the sky, and for one bright instant, she saw the shadow of a figure through the frosted glass of the door, tall, broad, drenched, swaying slightly. She tightened her grip on the poker. "Who's there?" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. No answer, just the rain and the wind and the rasping sound of someone breathing hard, labored, and wrong. She unbolted the door with one hand, poker raised in the other, and pulled it open. The man collapsed forward into her arms. The weight of him drove her backward, her shoulder slamming against the hallway wall as she struggled to keep them both upright. He was soaked through, his coat heavy with rain, and something darker that smeared across her nightgown. Blood. A tremendous amount of blood, warm and slick against her hands, pouring from somewhere beneath his left arm. His face pressed against her neck, and she felt the heat of fever radiating from his skin, the shallow, desperate rhythm of his breathing. "Please." The word was barely a whisper, torn from him like it cost everything he had left. "My horse threw me on the ridge road. I saw your light. I need." He trailed off, his legs buckling. Isolde dropped the poker and caught him with both arms, staggering under his weight. He was tall and solidly built, his clothes expensive even beneath the mud and blood. Fine wool, polished boots now caked with dirt, a signet ring on his right hand that caught the candlelight from the kitchen behind her. This was no ordinary traveler. "Stay awake," she ordered, dragging him toward the kitchen. "Whatever you do, don't close your eyes." She managed to lower him into the chair she'd been sleeping in moments ago. His head lolled back, dark hair plastered to a face sharp with pain. He was perhaps 30, with high cheekbones, and a jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. Even half-conscious and bleeding, there was something commanding about him, an authority that clung to him like the rain. Isolde grabbed the kitchen shears and cut away his coat, then his waistcoat. The shirt beneath was soaked crimson on the left side. She peeled the fabric back and found the wound, a deep gash along his ribs, jagged and ugly, the kind a branch or rock might tear into a body thrown from a horse at speed. Not fatal if she stopped the bleeding. Fatal if she didn't. She moved fast, pulling clean linen from the press, boiling water over the embers she coaxed back to life, retrieving the medical kit her mother had assembled years ago for exactly these kinds of emergencies. Living alone on the edge of the moors meant being your own doctor, your own protector, your own everything. The man drifted in and out of consciousness while she worked, cleaning the wound, pressing linen tight against the torn flesh, binding his ribs with steady hands that betrayed none of the panic screaming through her chest. At one point, his eyes opened fully and locked onto hers, pale and startling, glazed with pain, but sharply aware. "You're not a physician," he said, his voice rough. "No, I'm the woman whose door you nearly broke down at 2 a.m. Hold still." His lips twitched, something that might have been amusement if he'd had the strength for it. Then his eyes closed again, and his breathing evened out. Not the shallow gasping of before, but the deeper rhythm of unconsciousness. She tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels, hands trembling now that the urgency had passed. Blood stained her nightgown, her arms, the floor around them. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. She studied his face in the firelight. Whoever he was wealthy. The signet ring alone was worth more than everything she owned. His clothes, even ruined, spoke of London tailors, and the kind of life she'd only read about in the newspapers her father used to bring home from the village. She should send for the doctor in Thornfield. She should notify someone. But the rain was savage. The roads would be rivers by now, and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles across open moorland. Until morning, he was her responsibility. Isolde pulled a blanket from the back of the settle and draped it across him carefully, tucking it around his shoulders without disturbing the bandages. Then she retrieved her poker, positioned her mother's old rocking chair where she could watch both the stranger and the door, and settled in to wait for dawn. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled, and a stranger bled on her kitchen chair, and Isolde Marchetti had no idea that the man she'd just saved was about to dismantle every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her life. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the moors, the storm retreating into sullen drizzle. Isolde hadn't slept. She'd spent the remaining hours of the night monitoring the stranger's breathing, changing his bandages twice when the blood soaked through, and feeding the fire to keep the chill from settling into his bones. By first light, his fever had risen. His skin burned under her hand when she checked his forehead, and his breathing had taken on a rattling quality that made her stomach clench with worry. She was heating broth over the fire when hoofbeats thundered up the lane. Not one horse, but several, moving fast despite the muddy roads. Isolde barely had time to set down the pot before fists hammered against her door with the same urgency the stranger had shown hours earlier. She opened it to find 4 men on horseback and a 5th already dismounting, a tall man in a riding coat who moved with the rigid efficiency of someone accustomed to command. Behind them, a carriage was struggling up the rutted track, its fine black lacquer absurdly out of place against the wild moorland. "Where is he?" The dismounting man didn't introduce himself, didn't ask permission. His gaze swept past Isolde into the cottage with barely concealed desperation. "Where is the Duke?" The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Duke." She stepped aside wordlessly, and the man pushed past her into the kitchen, dropping to his knees beside the chair where the stranger lay. Your Grace, can you hear me?" "It's Collier. We've been searching all night." The stranger, the Duke, stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused, and fever-bright. "Collier, my horse. We found Apollo on the Ridge Road, Your Grace. Legs not broken, thank God. But you," he turned to Isolde, his expression shifting from relief to sharp assessment. "Who are you? What happened?" "My name is Isolde Marchetti. He arrived at my door around 2 this morning with a deep laceration along his left ribs. I cleaned and bound the wound, but he's developed a fever. He needs a proper physician." Collier stared at her, then at the bandages visible beneath the blanket, then at the blood-stained kitchen. "You did this yourself." There was no one else. The carriage had arrived now, and more men were entering her small cottage, filling it with the smell of wet wool and expensive leather. 2 of them lifted the Duke from the chair with practiced care, carrying him toward the carriage. His eyes found Isolde as they moved him, and even through the fever, that sharp awareness flickered. The woman, he managed, his hand catching Collier's sleeve. "She saved my life. See to it." "Yes, Your Grace." And then he was gone, carried into the black carriage that looked like it belonged in another world entirely. Doors closed, commands were shouted, and within minutes, the procession was moving back down the lane, leaving Isolde standing in her ruined kitchen with blood on her hands and the strange, disorienting feeling of having been caught up in a storm and set back down in a different landscape. A Duke. She'd spent the night saving a Duke's life. She looked down at her stained nightgown, at the bloody linens piled by the hearth, at the chair where he'd sat. His signet ring had left an impression in the wooden armrest where he'd gripped it during the worst of the pain. She touched the mark absently, then caught herself and pulled her hand back. It didn't matter who he was. He was injured. She'd helped. And now he was gone. That was the end of it. Except it wasn't. 3 hours later, a rider returned with a leather purse containing 20 guineas and a card embossed with gold lettering. Caspian Ashworth, Duke of Dunmore. Below the printed name, a handwritten line in an unsteady hand that spoke of fever and determination. I owe you a debt, Miss Marchetti. I intend to repay it. Isolde turned the card over in her hands, studying the elegant script. 20 guineas was more money than she earned in a year. It would fix the leaking roof, replace the broken fence, buy seed for the spring planting. It was a lifeline thrown from a world so far above hers that it might as well have been a different country. She pocketed the money. She placed the card on the mantelpiece beside her mother's small portrait. And she tried very hard not to think about pale eyes full of pain and a voice that said, please, like it was the last word he'd ever speak. 2 weeks passed. The roof was fixed. The fence was mended. Isolde bought seed and new boots and a woolen shawl that didn't have holes in it, and she tried to forget about the Duke of Dunmore. The Moors didn't care about dukes. There were sheep to tend, a garden to maintain, preserves to make for the winter. Life on the edge of the moorland was relentless and solitary, and it left little room for daydreaming about men with signet rings who collapsed through her door at midnight. Then the carriage returned, the same black lacquer, the same fine horses, but this time it stopped at her gate with deliberate, unhurried purpose. Collier stepped out first, opening the door for a figure who emerged slowly, favoring his left side, but standing tall despite it. Caspian Ashworth looked different in daylight, without the mud and blood and fever. He was dressed impeccably in a dark blue coat that matched the bruised sky behind him. His dark hair swept back from a face that was sharper than she remembered, more angular, dominated by those unsettling light eyes that seemed to appraise everything they touched. He was leaning on a silver-handled walking stick, the injury clearly still troubling him, but his bearing was that of a man who commanded rooms and landscapes with equal ease. Miss Marchetti. He inclined his head with a formality that felt absurd, given that she'd last seen him semi-conscious and bleeding on her kitchen chair. Your Grace. She didn't curtsy. She wasn't sure she knew how, and she wasn't about to embarrass herself trying. You look better than when we last met. A low bar, given that I was half dead at the time. May I come in? She hesitated. A duke in her cottage was like a hawk in a henhouse, magnificent and entirely wrong for the setting. But she stepped aside and led him into the kitchen, painfully aware of its smallness, its roughness, the patched curtains and scrubbed stone floor. He sat in the same chair. She noticed him glance at the armrest where his ring had left its mark, his expression unreadable. Collier remained outside with the carriage, which meant whatever the Duke had come to say, he wanted to say it privately. Tea, she offered, because her mother had taught her that hospitality cost nothing. Please. She set about making it, grateful for something to do with her hands. He watched her move through the small kitchen with that same assessing attention, and she fought the urge to smooth her hair or straighten her worn dress. She was who she was. If the cottage offended his aristocratic sensibilities, he could leave. I came to thank you properly, he said when she set the cup before him, and to make you a proposition. Her hand stilled on the teapot. I'm not sure I like that word coming from a duke sitting in my kitchen. His lips quirked, that same ghost of amusement she'd glimpsed the night he arrived. Not that kind of proposition, Miss Marchetti. I need help, and I believe you're uniquely suited to provide it. He set down his teacup with deliberate care. My mother is dying. She has weeks, perhaps a month. Her final wish is to see me settled, married, content. She's made it the singular focus of her remaining time, and she's invited a woman named Lady Patience Gould to Ashworth Hall for an extended stay with the explicit intention of brokering a match. I'm sorry about your mother, Isolde said carefully. But I don't see what this has to do with me. Lady Patience is my mother's choice, not mine. She's perfectly suitable on paper, but I have no desire to marry her, or anyone, while my mother is ill. Every moment spent entertaining Lady Patience's expectations is a moment stolen from the time I have left with my mother. But I can't refuse outright without breaking her heart. He met her eyes, and she saw something raw beneath the composure, grief already beginning even before the loss had fully arrived. I need someone to come to Ashworth Hall as a guest, someone my mother might believe I'm genuinely interested in, enough to slow her campaign for Lady Patience without an outright refusal. Someone outside society who won't be entangled in the consequences when it ends. You want me to pretend to be your romantic interest to stall your dying mother's matchmaking. When you phrase it like that, it sounds monstrous. How would you phrase it? Oh, he was quiet for a moment. I'd say I'm asking you to help me protect the time I have left with someone I love, from an obligation I can't escape, and a match I don't want. The kitchen was silent except for the wind pressing against the windows. And what do I get from this arrangement? She asked, because she wasn't naive, and kindness didn't pay for seed or boots or the 100 other things this cottage needed to survive another winter. Name your terms, he said simply. Whatever you need. Isolde looked at the Duke of Dunmore sitting in her kitchen, asking for her help with the same desperate intensity as the night he'd collapsed against her door. Different circumstances, same raw need underneath. She should say no. Every sensible part of her knew that walking into a duke's world, even temporarily, was like walking into a fire and hoping not to burn. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded, and she could see he'd expected that answer. When he stood, he winced slightly, his hand moving to his injured side. Don't take too long, Miss Marchetti. Time is the one thing I don't have. He left the card on her table again. Same gold lettering, same elegant script. But this time, written below in that unsteady hand, 3 words that stayed with her long after the carriage disappeared down the lane. Please help me. She thought about it for 2 days. 2 days of tending sheep and pulling weeds and staring at the gold-embossed card on her kitchen table while the wind howled across the moors like something grieving. 2 days of arguing with herself, listing reasons to refuse, and finding each one slightly less convincing than the last. On the 3rd morning, she walked to the village post office and sent a letter. 4 lines. No flourishes. Your Grace, I accept your proposition on the condition that we discuss terms before I set foot in your house. I will meet you at the coaching inn in Thornfield on Thursday at noon. Come alone, Isolde Marchetti. He came alone. She spotted him the moment she entered the inn's private dining room, seated by the window in a coat of charcoal gray, the walking stick propped against his chair. He rose when she entered, wincing only slightly. Whatever his physicians had done since she'd last seen him, the healing was progressing. His color was better. The sharp lines of pain around his eyes softened to something merely tired. Miss Marchetti, thank you for coming. She sat across from him without preamble. I have conditions. I expected nothing less. A serving girl brought tea and cold meat and bread. Isolde waited until she'd gone before speaking. First, I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into. Who lives at Ashworth Hall? Who will I encounter? And who knows this arrangement is a performance? Caspian's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, at her directness. Ashworth Hall is the family's principal estate in Derbyshire. Currently in residence are my mother, the Dowager Duchess, my younger brother, Hadrian, who is 22 and generally harmless, unless you get him started on horse breeding, Mrs. Lennox, the housekeeper, who has been with the family since before I was born, and Mrs. Nothing. And as of next week, Lady Patience Gould and her mother, Mrs. Gould, who will be arriving as my mother's guests. And which of them know the truth? None. He held up a hand before she could protest. My mother must believe this is genuine, or it serves no purpose. Hadrian can't keep a secret to save his life. Mrs. Lennox would disapprove on principle and tell my mother immediately. This works only if everyone believes you are exactly what you appear to be. And what do I appear to be? A young woman I met during my recovery on the moors. Someone who saved my life and captured my interest. That part, at least, has the advantage of being partially true. Isolde ignored the implication and pressed forward. Second condition. When this ends, however it ends, I leave with my reputation intact and my circumstances improved. I want a proper letter of reference from your household and enough to lease farmland of my own. Not charity. Payment for services rendered. How much land? 40 acres. Enough to run a flock and be self-sufficient. I'm tired of surviving on someone else's margins. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 3 years, Your Grace. I just never had the means to act on it. He studied her across the table, and she held his gaze without flinching. She'd learned long ago that looking away was the same as surrendering, and she couldn't afford to surrender anything else. 40 acres, he said. I have tenant land available near the estate, productive soil, good drainage, existing boundaries. It's yours when this concludes, with a proper lease at favorable terms. Not a gift. An arrangement. Third condition. Isolde set down her teacup with deliberate care. I won't lie to your mother about who I am. I'll play the role of a woman you're interested in, but I won't invent a false family or a fabricated history. If she asks about my background, I tell the truth. A farmer's daughter who lost her parents and works the land alone. Take it or leave it. The silence stretched between them like wire pulled taut. She could see him calculating, weighing the risk of honesty against the safety of deception. My mother will think you're beneath me, he said finally. Not cruelly, but as a statement of fact. Most people would agree with her. I don't. The words landed quietly but with weight. Isolde felt something shift in her chest, a door she'd bolted shut creaking slightly on its hinges. She ignored it. Then we have an agreement. Almost. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I have a condition of my own. Whatever happens at Ashworth Hall, whatever you see or hear regarding my mother's illness, it stays within those walls. Her dignity matters more to me than anything else in this arrangement. I won't have her final weeks become gossip for drawing rooms. You have my word, Your Grace. Caspian, if you're coming to my home as a potential match, you'll need to use my name. Calling me Your Grace over dinner will raise questions. Isolde tested the name silently, feeling its shape. It was a name that belonged to libraries and ballrooms and places she'd never been, not to moorland kitchens and muddy sheep pens. Caspian, she said aloud. Fine. And you'll call me Isolde. He extended his hand across the table. Not the formal bow he'd given her at the cottage, but a straightforward handshake, the kind you'd offer a partner in business. She took it. His grip was firm and warm, and the signet ring pressed briefly against her fingers. I'll send a carriage on Monday, he said. Bring whatever you need. We'll say you've been invited as a guest to thank you for your help during my accident. That's the truth. Exactly. The best deceptions are built on truth, Miss Isolde. She pulled her hand back. Don't make me regret this. He almost smiled. I'll do my best. She left the inn first, walking out into the gray thornfield afternoon, with the distinct sensation of having just stepped off solid ground and into open air. Behind her, through the window, she could feel him watching her go. Monday. 4 days to pack up her life and walk into someone else's. She quickened her pace against the wind and didn't look back. The carriage arrived at dawn on Monday, black and gleaming and hopelessly conspicuous on the narrow moorland track. Collier drove. He nodded to Isolde with something approaching respect as he loaded her single trunk, a battered leather case that contained everything she owned that mattered. 2 dresses, both practical. Her mother's recipe book, her father's folding knife, a pouch of dried lavender from the garden, a wool shawl that didn't have holes in it, thanks to the Duke's 20 guineas. She locked the cottage door, pocketed the key, and climbed into the carriage without ceremony. The leather seats were softer than her bed. She ran her fingers across them once, then folded her hands in her lap and watched the moors roll past, wild and familiar, and slowly giving way to something else. The journey took 5 hours. Moorland became farmland, farmland became woodland, and woodland became the kind of manicured parkland that announced wealth long before any building came into view. Rolling hills sculpted by generations of careful tending, ancient oaks lining a private road that seemed to stretch forever, a lake glinting silver in the afternoon light. Then Ashworth Hall appeared, and Isolde's breath simply stopped. It was enormous. Not just large in the way she'd imagined, but vast in a way that redefined her understanding of the word. A sprawling Palladian facade of honey-colored stone, columns flanking a central entrance that could have swallowed her entire cottage. Wings extended on either side like arms, opened in welcome or warning. She couldn't tell which. Gardens cascaded down terraced slopes, and somewhere behind the house, she could hear the distant sound of a fountain. She sat frozen in the carriage, staring through the window, her single battered trunk suddenly the most absurd object in existence. Collier opened the door. "Miss Marchetti, welcome to Ashworth Hall." She stepped out onto gravel so perfectly raked it looked like it had never been walked on. Servants were already emerging from the entrance, a line of them in crisp uniforms, moving with choreographed precision. A woman in severe black led them, her posture as straight as the columns behind her, and her expression carefully neutral in a way that managed to communicate judgment without a single word spoken. "Miss Marchetti, I'm Mrs. Lennox, the housekeeper. His Grace has asked me to show you to your rooms. Rooms. Plural." Isolde followed the woman through the entrance hall and had to physically stop herself from gaping. Marble floors polished to mirrors, a staircase that curved upward like something from a dream. Portraits of Ashworth ancestors, watching from gilded frames with expressions that ranged from stern to vaguely disappointed, as if they could already tell she didn't belong. The guest suite was on the 2nd floor, east wing, a bedroom with ceilings so high she could barely make out the plasterwork, a sitting room with its own fireplace and writing desk, a dressing room with a wardrobe that could have housed a family of 4. The bed was canopied in pale green silk, the sheets so white they seemed to glow. Her trunk sat in the center of the dressing room floor like a stone dropped in a cathedral. A young maid appeared, curtsying. "Miss, I'm Nell. I've been assigned to attend you during your stay. Shall I unpack your things?" Isolde looked at her single trunk, at the vast wardrobe, at Nell's carefully neutral expression. "There isn't much to unpack." "That's quite all right, miss. Lady Dunmore has arranged for Madame Colville to visit tomorrow for fittings. You'll have a full wardrobe within the week. Lady Dunmore, the Dowager." Caspian's dying mother was already dressing her before they'd even met. Isolde wasn't sure if that was generosity, or strategy, or something more complicated than either. She unpacked herself, ignoring Nell's polite distress at not being allowed to help. Her 2 dresses looked pitiful, hanging in the enormous wardrobe, like sparrows perched in a ballroom. She placed her mother's recipe book on the writing desk, her father's knife in the nightstand drawer, and the lavender pouch on the pillow. There. Now it smelled like home, even if nothing else felt like it. She found Caspian in a ground-floor study lined with maps and estate documents. He was standing at the window, watching the gardens, and turned when she entered. His walking stick was absent. Either the injury had healed, or his pride had overruled it. "You're settled." I'm overwhelmed, but I'll manage. Your housekeeper looks at me like she's cataloging my flaws for a report. She does that to everyone. Don't take it personally. And your mother? Resting. She tires easily now. He said it flatly, the way people spoke about things that hurt too much for inflection. She'll join us for dinner. That will be your first meeting. Any guidance? Be yourself. She values honesty above everything. She'll see through pretense in seconds. You told me to pretend. I told you to be a woman I'm interested in. I didn't tell you to be someone you're not. There's a difference. Before she could respond, a door crashed open somewhere in the house, followed by rapid footsteps and a voice that carried the energy of a small hurricane. Is she here? Caspian, is she here? Tell me she's here. Tell. I've been waiting all day. A young man burst into the study, tall and lanky with the same dark hair as Caspian, but none of his composure. He had an open, eager face, slightly sunburned, and the kind of restless energy that suggested he'd rather be outdoors than anywhere with walls. Hadrian. Caspian's voice carried a warning that his brother completely ignored. You must be Isolde. Hadrian seized her hand and shook it vigorously. The woman who saved my brother's life with kitchen shears and linen strips. That's the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. Was there a great deal of blood? Caspian never tells me anything interesting. There was a great deal of blood, Isolde confirmed, startled into honesty by his enthusiasm. Magnificent. I knew it. He's been unbearably mysterious about the whole thing, which means it was either very dramatic or very embarrassing. Probably both. Are you really a shepherdess? Do you have a crook? Do the sheep have names? Hadrian. Caspian's voice had sharpened. Perhaps let Miss Marchetti breathe before you interrogate her. But Hadrian's warmth was disarming, and Isolde found herself almost smiling. Some of them have names, she said. The difficult ones mostly. Hadrian beamed. I like her already. Mother's going to be fascinated. Dinner is at 7, by the way. Wear something, he gestured vaguely. Duchessy. He vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving a trail of energy in his wake. Isolde turned to Caspian. Is he always like that? Always. Caspian's expression was unreadable, but something softened at the edges. He's the only genuinely happy person in this house. Don't let him lose that. It wasn't a request. It was a plea disguised as an instruction, and it told Isolde more about the Duke of Dunmore than anything else he'd said. 7 o'clock. Dinner with a dying duchess who could see through pretense. Isolde looked down at her worn dress, at her calloused hands, at the woman she actually was standing in the middle of a life she'd borrowed. This was either going to work, or it was going to be the most spectacular failure of her life. The Dowager Duchess of Dunmore was not what Isolde expected. She'd imagined frailty, pallor, the visible markers of illness that she'd seen take her own mother. But Evadne Ashworth descended to dinner in a gown of deep burgundy silk, her silver hair swept up with pearl-tipped pins, her posture so regal it made the chair she settled into look like a throne. Only her eyes betrayed her, sunken slightly, shadowed with a fatigue that no amount of powder could fully conceal. And her hands, thin, almost translucent, gripping the table's edge as she sat with a care that suggested the simple act of sitting down required more strength than she wanted to admit. She was beautiful in the way old cathedrals were beautiful, worn and weathered, but still commanding awe. So, she said, her gaze fixing on Isolde with an intensity that pinned her to her chair. You're the young woman who pulled my son off the floor and stitched him together with kitchen linen. It wasn't quite stitching, Your Grace. More like aggressive bandaging. Evadne's lips twitched. Hadrian, who was already halfway through his soup, made an enthusiastic noise. I told you she was wonderful. I'll decide that for myself, thank you. The Dowager studied Isolde over the rim of her wineglass. Your name is Italian. My father's family. He came to England as a young man, married an Englishwoman and settled on the moors. They're both gone now. I'm sorry for your loss. How long? My mother 3 years ago. My father the year before that. And you've been alone since? I have. By choice? By necessity. Isolde held the older woman's gaze. The farm doesn't run itself, and I couldn't afford to hire help. So I learned to manage alone. Evadne set down her glass. You're direct. I appreciate that. Most young women who arrive at my table spend the first hour trying to impress me with accomplishments they don't possess. Can you play the pianoforte? No, Your Grace. Do you paint? Only fence posts. Hadrian choked on his wine. Caspian's expression didn't change, but Isolde caught the barely perceptible shift at the corner of his mouth. And yet my son finds you interesting enough to invite to his home. The dowager's tone was conversational, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Why do you suppose that is? Because I saved his life and he feels obligated. Is that all? You'd have to ask him, Your Grace. I'm asking you. The dining room fell silent. Hadrian's spoon hovered midair. Caspian sat very still, his gaze moving between Isolde and his mother, with an expression she couldn't read. Isolde set down her fork and spoke carefully. I think your son is a man carrying a great deal of weight, and I think he found it easier to breathe in my kitchen than he does in most rooms. Whether that's about me or simply about being somewhere without expectations, I honestly don't know. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the candles flickering. Then Evadne laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and warm, and it transformed her face entirely, erasing years and illness in a single bright moment. Hadrian exhaled with visible relief. Caspian looked at Isolde with something she hadn't seen in his expression before, something unguarded and almost vulnerable that vanished the moment he noticed her noticing. You'll do, the dowager said, for now. We'll see how you handle Lady Patience. Dinner continued with lighter conversation. Hadrian dominated it cheerfully, telling stories about his horses, about the estate, about Caspian's childhood mishaps that made the Duke's jaw tighten with brotherly exasperation. Evadne contributed sharp observations and dry wit that reminded Isolde of her own mother, a woman who could level you with a sentence and make you grateful for the correction. When the men withdrew for port, a ritual Isolde found baffling. Evadne gestured for her to stay. Walk with me. The dowager moved slowly through the house, her hand resting lightly on Isolde's arm, in a way that could have been companionship, but was clearly necessity. Her strength was fading. The performance at dinner had cost her. They reached a small sitting room off the main gallery, intimate and warm, filled with personal touches, embroidered cushions, a half-finished watercolor on an easel, books stacked on every surface. This was the dowager's private space, and being invited into it felt significant. Sit with me, Evadne said, lowering herself into a chair by the fire. And listen, because I won't say this twice. Isolde sat. I know what my son is doing. The dowager's voice was quiet but precise. He thinks he's being clever, bringing you here to distract me from Lady Patience. He thinks I can't see through a scheme he's been constructing since Tuesday. Isolde's stomach dropped. Your Grace, Don't insult me with denial. I've known that boy for 32 years. He can't hide anything from me, except the things that truly matter, and those he hides so well that not even he knows where he's put them. Evadne leaned forward, and in the firelight, her illness was suddenly, terribly visible. The thinness of her wrists, the faint yellow tinge beneath her powdered skin, the exhaustion pooling in her eyes. I am dying, Miss Marchetti. Not dramatically, not quickly, but certainly. The physicians give me weeks. I give myself perhaps a month, because I've always been more stubborn than they expected. And in whatever time I have left, I want one thing for my eldest son: to see him married. No, to see him feel something. Evadne's voice cracked, just slightly, before she steadied it. His father died 2 years ago, and something shut down inside him. He performs his duties. He manages the estates. He is responsible and capable, and utterly, completely hollow. Grief has turned him into a monument instead of a man. I don't care if he marries you or Lady Patience or no one at all. I care that he stops sleepwalking through his own life before I'm gone, and there's no one left who remembers what he was like before. Isolde's throat tightened. She thought of the night he'd arrived at her door, the way he'd said please like it was torn from him, the only unguarded moment she'd witnessed. Lady Patience won't wake him up, Evadne continued. She's suitable and safe, and she'll let him stay exactly as he is, comfortable, numb, dead inside while his heart keeps beating. I invited her because it's expected, because duty demands I try. But I don't actually want him to choose her. Then what do you want? I want him to choose something. Anything. With passion. With conviction. With the kind of reckless certainty his father had when he chose me against everyone's advice. I want to see fire in my son before I die, Miss Marchetti, even if it burns everything down. The fire crackled between them. Isolde sat very still, the weight of a dying woman's hope pressing down on her like stone. I can't promise that, she said quietly. I can't make someone feel things they've locked away. No. But you can refuse to let him stay locked. The Dowager reached out and took Isolde's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. And if you hurt him, if this is merely an opportunity to you and nothing more, I will use whatever time I have left to ensure you regret it deeply. I understand. Good. Evadne released her hand and settled back into her chair, the fierce energy draining from her as quickly as it had appeared. Now, tell me about your sheep. Isolde blinked. My sheep? You said the difficult ones have names. I'd like to hear them. So Isolde told her about the sheep, about the moors, about the farm and the wind, and the stubborn ewes who escaped every fence she built. And the Dowager listened with closed eyes and a faint smile. And when Isolde finally ran out of words, Evadne was asleep in her chair, her thin hands folded in her lap, her breathing shallow but steady. Isolde draped a blanket over her carefully and left the room without a sound. In the hallway, she found Caspian waiting, his shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, his expression taut with something she recognized. Fear. She knows, Isolde said quietly. I assumed she would. She doesn't care about the scheme. She cares about you. His jaw tightened. What did she say? That she wants to see fire in you before she dies. That Lady Patience won't provide it. And you? Can you? The question hung between them in the dim hallway, heavy with things neither of them was ready to name. I don't know, Isolde said honestly, but I think that's a better answer than no. She walked past him toward her room, and she felt his gaze follow her all the way down the corridor, steady and searching, and full of something that might have been the beginning of hope. Lady Patience Gould arrived on a Tuesday, trailing silk and certainty like a ship cutting through still water. She was tall and fair, with cornflower blue eyes, and the kind of porcelain composure that suggested she'd been sculpted rather than born. Her mother, Mrs. Gould, was a smaller, sharper version of the same design, with a calculating gaze that swept through Ashworth Hall like an inventory. Isolde watched their arrival from the library window, standing behind the curtain like a spy in her own borrowed life. Caspian met them at the entrance with Hadrian at his side, all formal courtesy and ducal hospitality. Lady Patience curtsied with geometric precision. Mrs. Gould smiled with the satisfied air of a woman who'd already planned the wedding breakfast. She's very beautiful, Isolde said to no one. She's very boring, Hadrian's voice replied from behind her. Isolde spun to find him sprawled across a reading chair, boots on the upholstery, in a way that would have given Mrs. Lennox a seizure. I've met her 3 times. Each conversation felt like drowning in warm milk, pleasant, suffocating, impossible to escape. That's unkind. It's accurate. Watch her at dinner tonight. She agrees with everything Caspian says, every single thing. It's eerie. If he told her the sky was green, she'd compliment the shade. Dinner confirmed Hadrian's assessment with surgical precision. Lady Patience was perfectly mannered, perfectly dressed, perfectly agreeable, and perfectly empty. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right dishes, expressed interest in the right topics, and left absolutely no impression whatsoever. It was like watching someone perform the idea of a person without actually being one. Mrs. Gould, by contrast, was sharply present. Her eyes tracked every interaction, every glance, every pause. When Isolde spoke, Mrs. Gould studied her with the focused attention of someone cataloging a threat. "Miss Marchetti," Lady Patience said over dessert, her voice sweet as spun sugar. "Caspian tells us you're a farmer. How fascinating. I've always wondered what country life is like for those who actually work the land." The emphasis on actually was delicate but deliberate. Isolde felt the blade beneath the silk. "It's mostly mud and stubbornness," she replied. "Not unlike London society, I imagine." Hadrian inhaled his wine. Caspian's hand stilled on his glass. Evadne, who had joined dinner with visible effort, made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh. Lady Patience's smile didn't waver. "How charming. You have such a natural wit. It must come from all that fresh air." The rest of the evening was a careful choreography of politeness masking warfare. Lady Patience positioned herself beside Caspian at every opportunity, touching his arm when she laughed, leaning close when she spoke, radiating possession without ever making an explicit claim. Mrs. Gould engaged Evadne in conversation about the estate, the title, the responsibilities of a duchess, all framed as innocent curiosity, but aimed like arrows. Isolde retreated to the edges, watching the performance with growing discomfort. She didn't belong in this world of coded language and strategic smiles. Her weapons were bluntness and honesty, and neither served her here. Later that night, she found Caspian in the garden. He stood on the stone terrace, hands in his pockets, staring at the dark grounds, with the fixed intensity of a man trying to see something that wasn't there. "Your mother is exhausted," Isolde said, stepping out beside him. "She shouldn't have come down for dinner. She wanted to observe, to see you and Patience in the same room. And what did she observe? That Lady Patience is exactly as suitable as expected. Is that what you think?" "I think Lady Patience is a mirror. She reflects whatever the person in front of her wants to see. That's useful in a duchess, perhaps. But it's not real." Caspian turned to her, and in the moonlight his eyes were silver. "What do you see when you look at me?" The question caught her off guard. She considered deflecting, offering something safe and meaningless. Instead, she told the truth. "I see a man standing in a garden at midnight because he can't bear to be inside his own house. I see someone who carries grief like a second skeleton, holding him upright and crushing him at the same time. I see someone who's afraid of losing his mother, and even more afraid of admitting it." His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a wall developing a crack, too thin to see, but too deep to ignore. "You see too much," he said quietly. "You asked." "I did." He looked away, back at the darkened gardens. "The Ashworth Summer Ball is in 10 days. My mother insists on hosting it despite her condition. She says it's tradition, and she won't let illness steal one more thing from this family. Lady Patience expects to be presented as my particular interest. My mother expects to see me choose. And what do you expect? I expect to feel nothing, as usual." He said it without self-pity, as a simple fact. "Except when you're nearby. Then I feel too much, and I don't know what to do with any of it." He left before she could respond, walking into the dark garden with long strides that carried him away from his own admission. Isolde stood on the terrace, the night air cool against her flushed skin, and wondered when exactly she'd stopped performing and started caring. The days before the ball became a strange battlefield. Lady Patience occupied Caspian's time with relentless grace, suggesting rides, walks, reading together in the drawing room. Mrs. Gould insinuated herself into Evadne's confidence, discussing household management and family lineage with the efficiency of a woman building a case. Isolde found herself pushed to the margins. At meals, Lady Patience dominated conversation. During afternoon calls, Mrs. Gould positioned her daughter beside Caspian with strategic precision. Hadrian tried to balance things, pulling Isolde into conversations, making room at tables, but even his cheerful energy couldn't overcome the Goulds' practiced campaign. "You can't let her win," Hadrian said bluntly on the 5th day, finding Isolde in the kitchen garden pulling weeds with unnecessary violence. "Win what? There's no competition. Isn't there?" He crouched beside her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "I've watched my brother for the past week. When Patience talks to him, he's polite and empty. When you talk to him, he's awake. Actually awake, like someone turned a light on inside a dark room. I don't know what's between you two, and I don't need to know. But I know my brother, and I know what it looks like when he's alive versus when he's just going through the motions. Don't let him disappear back into the motions because some overdressed China doll is better at playing the game." "I'm not playing any game, Hadrian." "Then maybe you should start. Because Patience is, and she's good at it. And if she succeeds, my brother spends the rest of his life married to a woman who'll never challenge him, never surprise him, never make him feel anything beyond comfortable obligation. He'll be perfectly appropriate and perfectly dead inside, and my mother will die, knowing she failed to save him." The words hit like cold water. Isolde sat back on her heels, dirt on her hands, the summer sun warm on her back, and felt something harden inside her. Not ambition, not competition, something simpler and fiercer. She wasn't going to let Caspian Ashworth disappear into a life of beautiful numbness, not because she wanted his title or his wealth or his world, but because she'd seen the man underneath, bleeding on her kitchen chair, saying please like it was the last word he knew. That man deserved more than a mirror. "Fine," she said. "What do I wear to a ball?" Hadrian's grin was blinding. "Leave that to me." Madame Colville had delivered the wardrobe days earlier, but Isolde had barely touched it, feeling like a fraud every time she opened the wardrobe doors. Now, the evening of the Ashworth ball, she stood in front of the mirror in a gown of deep midnight blue silk that Hadrian had specifically requested. It was simpler than anything Lady Patience would wear, elegant without being ornate, the color rich and dark against Isolde's olive skin and dark hair. Nell had arranged her hair with small white flowers from the garden, tiny and fragrant, nothing expensive and nothing borrowed. She looked like herself, only illuminated, like someone had turned a lantern on inside her and the light was shining through. Evadne appeared in her doorway, leaning heavily on a cane she hadn't used a week ago. The illness was accelerating. Even her careful performances couldn't fully conceal it now. "Blue," the dowager said. "Good. Patience will be in pink. You'll look like midnight standing next to cotton candy. Your Grace, you should be resting. I'll rest when I'm dead, which will be soon enough. Tonight I want to watch my son make a decision, even if it's the wrong one. Especially if it's the wrong one. Wrong decisions made with conviction are worth more than right ones made from cowardice." She studied Isolde for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll do more than do tonight. You'll shine. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The ballroom at Ashworth Hall was transformed. Hundreds of candles blazed from chandeliers and sconces, casting golden light across a room filled with Derbyshire's finest families. Music floated from a small orchestra positioned in the gallery. Flowers cascaded from every surface, white roses and trailing ivy, Evadne's signature, her last grand gesture as mistress of this house. Isolde descended the staircase alone. No escort, no announcement. Just a woman in blue walking into a room full of strangers who were already whispering about her. She felt their eyes like heat, curious, dismissive, intrigued. Caspian stood near the entrance, receiving guests with Hadrian. He wore black evening dress that made him look carved from shadow, severe and striking. Lady Patience was already beside him in pale pink, exactly as Evadne had predicted, her hand resting on his arm with casual possession. When Caspian saw Isolde, he went still. Not the controlled stillness she'd grown accustomed to, the careful blankness he wore like armor. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who'd been struck and hadn't yet remembered how to move. Lady Patience noticed. Her fingers tightened on his arm. "Your Grace? Is something wrong?" "Nothing," he said, but his attention hadn't left Isolde. "Excuse me for a moment." He crossed the ballroom to her, and the whispers intensified. Lady Patience's smile hardened to porcelain. Mrs. Gould's expression sharpened to a blade. "You look," he began, then stopped, started again. "That dress. Hadrian chose it. Remind me to thank him." He offered his hand. "Will you dance? Won't that cause problems?" "Almost certainly." He held her gaze, and she saw the faintest crack in his composure, something warm and reckless underneath. "Dance with me anyway." She took his hand. The orchestra began a waltz, and they moved together with the ease of two people who'd been circling each other for weeks, finally letting gravity win. His hand at her waist burned through the silk. Her palm against his shoulder felt his heartbeat, faster than his composed expression would suggest. "People are staring," she said. "Let them stare." "Let. Lady Patience is furious. Lady Patience will survive." He pulled her slightly closer, just enough to cross the line between formal and intimate. "Isolde, I need to tell you something." That sounds ominous. "My mother collapsed this afternoon. The physicians say her time is shorter than we thought. Days, perhaps. A week at most." The words knocked the air from her lungs. "Caspian, I'm so sorry. She asked me something tonight, before the ball. She asked if I loved you." Isolde's heart stopped. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." His jaw tightened. "I said I didn't know, because I've spent so long not feeling anything that I can't tell the difference between love and the mere absence of numbness." But that was a lie. The waltz carried them past the watching crowd, past Lady Patience's frozen smile, past Mrs. Gould's calculating stare, past Hadrian's anxious hope. "It was a lie," Caspian continued, his voice dropping to something only she could hear, "because I know exactly what this is. I've known since you told me to hold still while you bandaged me in your kitchen, since you sat in a coaching inn and demanded 40 acres like a general negotiating terms, since you told my mother about your sheep and she fell asleep smiling for the first time in months. Caspian, don't. Not here. Where, then? When?" He pulled back enough to look at her, and his eyes were raw in a way she'd never seen. "My mother is dying. Time is not something I have the luxury of wasting. So I'm telling you now, in front of everyone, because I'm tired of being appropriate, and I'm tired of being numb, and I'm tired of pretending that you're just an arrangement." The waltz ended. They stood in the center of the ballroom, the silence around them charged, like the air before a storm. "Miss Marchetti," Lady Patience's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "I believe the next dance is mine with His Grace. We did agree, didn't we, Your Grace?" Caspian didn't look at her. His focus stayed on Isolde, searching, waiting. "Go," Isolde whispered. "Dance with her. We'll talk later." He released her hand slowly, reluctantly, and let Lady Patience lead him away. Isolde stepped back into the crowd, on legs that barely held her, her mind reeling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found the nearest doorway and escaped into a corridor, pressing her back against the cool stone wall, breathing hard. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't the arrangement. She was supposed to be a distraction, a temporary presence, a woman who'd return to her moors when the season ended with 40 acres and nothing more. She wasn't supposed to fall in love with a man who was about to lose his mother. She wasn't supposed to feel like her chest was breaking open every time he looked at her. She wasn't supposed to want this. Footsteps in the corridor. She straightened, expecting Caspian, expecting Hadrian. It was Mrs. Gould. The older woman stood in the corridor with the composed menace of someone who'd come to deliver a verdict. Her smile was polished and cold. "Miss Marchetti, I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Isolde lifted her chin. "By all means. My daughter will be the Duchess of Dunmore. This has been arranged between our families for over a year. The Dowager's illness has accelerated the timeline, but the outcome was never in question. You are an inconvenience, a temporary distraction for a grieving man who isn't thinking clearly. I'm not trying to steal anyone's future, Mrs. Gould, aren't you?" The woman stepped closer. A farmer's daughter wearing a borrowed dress in a borrowed house, playing at being something she's not. How long do you think this fantasy lasts? How long before he sees you for what you actually are? Each word was a precisely aimed stone, and each one hit its mark. Because Mrs. Gould wasn't saying anything Isolde hadn't already thought in the dark hours before dawn. "I know exactly what I am," Isolde said, her voice steady despite the fracturing inside. "And so does he. That's the difference between me and your daughter. He doesn't have to pretend when he's with me." Mrs. Gould's expression hardened. "You'll regret this, Miss Marchetti. Society has a long memory and very sharp teeth." She swept back toward the ballroom, leaving Isolde alone in the corridor, with her racing heart and the terrible, exhilarating certainty that she'd just drawn a line she couldn't uncross. The morning after the ball, everything shattered. Isolde came downstairs to find the breakfast room silent and tense. Hadrian sat with his head in his hands. Caspian was absent. Mrs. Lennox stood in the doorway with an expression that had finally abandoned neutrality for open distress. "What's happened?" "It's Mother," Hadrian said without looking up. "She collapsed again last night, after the ball. The physicians are with her now. Isolde's blood ran cold. Is she? She's alive." But his voice broke. "They're saying today might be the last clear day. After this, she may not wake again." Isolde moved toward the stairs, but Mrs. Lennox stepped into her path. "His Grace has asked that no one disturb the Dowager except family, miss." The word family landed like a door slamming shut. Isolde wasn't family. She was a guest, an arrangement, a temporary fixture who had no claim on the grief unfolding behind closed doors. She nodded and retreated to the library, where she sat with her hands folded and her heart aching for a woman who'd laughed at her sheep stories and called her son a monument instead of a man. Hours passed. Servants moved through the house in hushed urgency. Lady Patience and Mrs. Gould withdrew to their rooms with appropriate murmurs of concern. Hadrian disappeared upstairs and didn't come back down. Caspian found her at dusk. He stood in the library doorway looking gutted, aged 10 years and 12 hours. His cravat was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hair disordered from running his hands through it repeatedly. "She's sleeping," he said. "The physicians have made her comfortable. Caspian, I'm so sorry. What can I do?" "Nothing." His voice was flat, emptied of everything. "There's nothing anyone can do." He crossed to the desk and began shuffling papers with mechanical precision, the same retreat into duty she'd watched him perform before. Estate correspondence, account ledgers, the machinery of responsibility grinding forward regardless of what was happening in the rooms above. "Stop," she said. "Don't do this. Don't disappear into paperwork while your mother is upstairs dying. I am managing my affairs, Miss Marchetti. I'd thank you not to tell me how to grieve." Miss Marchetti, the formality stung worse than anything Mrs. Gould had said. Caspian. She stood, moving toward him. Last night, at the ball, you said... I said a great many things I shouldn't have. His voice was ice. I was emotional and indiscreet, and I put you in an impossible position in front of half the county. That was unconscionable. So you're taking it back. I'm restoring clarity. He didn't look at her. My mother is dying. Lady Patience's family expects an answer. The estate requires my full attention. I don't have the luxury of complicating matters further. Complicating matters. Is that what I am? He was silent. The silence said everything his words wouldn't. Something broke inside Isolde then. Not loudly, not dramatically. A quiet snap, like a thread pulled too tight for too long. I see, she said. You're afraid. And instead of admitting it, you're retreating behind the title and the ledgers and the word duty because feeling things terrifies you more than losing them. His hand tightened on the pen until his knuckles went white. Your mother begged me not to let you stay locked inside yourself. She said she wanted to see fire in you before she died, and for one night, one single night, I thought I saw it too. But you'd rather be safe and empty than risk being hurt. So be safe, Your Grace. Marry Lady Patience. Be numb. Be appropriate. Be everything your mother is terrified you'll become. Get out. The words were barely audible. I was already leaving. She walked from the library without looking back. In her room, she packed her single trunk with the same calm efficiency she'd used to bandage a bleeding duke on a storm-soaked night. 2 dresses, her mother's recipe book, her father's knife, the lavender pouch. She paused at the wardrobe, at the midnight blue gown still hanging where Nell had placed it. She touched the silk once, briefly, then closed the wardrobe door. She left no letter. There was nothing to say that she hadn't already said to his face. Collier drove her to Thornfield in silence. He helped her down at the coaching inn, handed her the trunk, and hesitated. Miss, for what it's worth, I've served His Grace for 11 years. I've never seen him the way he's been since you arrived. It wasn't enough, she said. Give my regards to Hadrian. And please, when the Dowager wakes, tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. She turned away before he could respond, walked into the coaching inn, and booked passage on the morning mail coach heading north. Behind her, the carriage stood in the inn yard for a long time before it finally turned and drove back toward Ashworth Hall. The cottage was exactly as she'd left it. The same stone walls, the same cold hearth, the same view of moorland stretching to the horizon like an ocean made of earth and heather. Even the chair where Caspian had sat was unchanged, the armrest still bearing the faint impression of his signet ring. Isolde unpacked her trunk, rebuilt the fire, and checked the sheep. The rhythms of survival reasserted themselves with mechanical familiarity. Feed the animals, mend the fence, boil water, eat, sleep, repeat. She didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind howling across the moors and thought about pale eyes full of pain and a voice that said, "Please," like a prayer, and I feel alive like a confession torn from stone. 3 days passed. She pulled weeds. She fixed a gate hinge. She baked bread that tasted like nothing. She read the same page of a book 11 times without absorbing a single word. On the 4th day, a letter arrived, not from Caspian, from Hadrian. Isolde, Mother died this morning. She went peacefully, in her sleep. Caspian was with her. She woke once, near the end, and asked for you. He told her you'd gone home. She said, "Good. That one doesn't run from anything. She's running towards something she hasn't figured out yet." I don't know what she meant, but it sounded right. Lady Patience left yesterday. Caspian dismissed her, actually dismissed her, told Mrs. Gould there would be no match, no courtship, no further discussion. Mrs. Gould threatened scandal. Caspian said he'd welcome the variety. Then he locked himself in his study and hasn't come out since. He won't eat. He won't talk to me. He won't talk to anyone. The funeral is Thursday. I'm not asking you to come back. I know what happened. He told me, in his way, which means he told me almost nothing, and I filled in the rest. But I want you to know that my mother liked you. Actually liked you. Not tolerated you. Not approved of you strategically, but liked you as a person. She told me the night of the ball that you were the first real thing that had walked through our door in years. I don't know what that means for you and Caspian. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I thought you should know. Your friend, Hadrian. Isolde read the letter 3 times. Then she sat at her kitchen table, pressed her forehead against the worn wood, and cried. She cried for Evadne, who had wanted fire and died waiting for it. She cried for Caspian, locked in his study, shuttered and alone. She cried for herself, for the 40 acres she'd bargained for, and the life she'd walked away from, and the terrifying possibility that she'd made the worst mistake of her life by confusing self-preservation with courage. On the 5th day, a package arrived at the village post office. Old Mr. Bramwell, who kept sheep on the adjacent hills and checked on her occasionally with the gruff kindness of a man who expressed concern through practical action, brought it up the lane. "Fancy paper," he said, handing over the small wrapped parcel. "Somebody important, I'd wager." Isolde unwrapped it at the kitchen table. Inside was a book, leather-bound, well-worn, pages soft from years of handling, a collection of Keats, with notes in the margins in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, elegant, feminine. A note was tucked inside the cover, written in Evadne's hand, with an instruction on the envelope in Mrs. Lennox's precise script. To be delivered to Miss Marchetti upon my passing. Miss Marchetti, this was my favorite. My husband gave it to me the day he proposed. I've carried it for 34 years. I want you to have it, not because of my son, but because you reminded me what it feels like to be real in a house full of performances. Whatever you decide, decide it with fire. Evadne. Isolde held the book to her chest and understood, finally, what Evadne had been trying to tell her all along. Not to save Caspian, not to fix him, or wake him, or perform some miraculous transformation. Simply to be real. To be honest. To refuse the comfortable numbness that grief and fear and propriety conspired to create. She'd run because she was afraid. Afraid of wanting something she couldn't keep. Afraid of loving someone whose world would never fully accept her. Afraid that the cottage and the moors and the safe, small life she'd built were all she deserved. But Evadne's voice echoed in her mind. That one doesn't run from anything. She's running towards something she hasn't figured out yet. Isolde set the Keats on the table beside Caspian's card, still sitting on the mantelpiece where she'd placed it weeks ago. 2 objects from 2 Ashworths, both asking her the same question. "Are you brave enough?" She stood in her kitchen, wind rattling the windows, and made a decision. She pulled on her boots, locked the cottage door, and walked to the village to hire a horse. She arrived at Ashworth Hall at dusk, travel-worn and wind-blown, and carrying nothing but her mother's recipe book and the Keats tucked inside her coat. The great house looked different in grief. Curtains drawn, black crap on the door, the gardens untended in a way that would have horrified Evadne. Collier met her at the gate. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. "He's in the study, miss. Hasn't come out in 2 days. Hadrian's tried everything." Isolde walked through the entrance hall without waiting for an escort, past the marble floors and the ancestor portraits and the staircase that curved like a dream, past the morning room where she'd first met Hadrian's hurricane energy, past the library where she'd watched Caspian retreat into ledgers rather than face his own heart. The study door was locked. She knocked. No answer. "Caspian." "It's Isolde." "Open the door." Silence. "I rode 6 hours across open moorland to get here. My legs are numb, I smell like horse, and I haven't eaten since breakfast." "Open the door, or I'll have Collier remove it from its hinges." A pause, then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened 2 inches. One eye regarded her through the gap, bloodshot and exhausted. "You left," he said. "You told me to get out." "I was grieving. You were hiding. There's a difference. Can I come in?" He opened the door fully and stepped back. The study was a disaster. Papers everywhere. Half-eaten meals on trays. Curtains drawn against the daylight. Caspian looked like a man who'd been at war. Unshaven. His shirt wrinkled and his cravat absent. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, arms crossed, every line of his body defensive. "My mother is dead," he said. "I know," Hadrian wrote to me. "I'm so sorry, Caspian. She didn't suffer." At the end, he stopped. His shoulders tightened. "At the end, she asked for you. She wanted to know if you were coming back." Isolde's throat ached. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd gone. That I'd driven you away because I was afraid." She said, "Of course you did. You're your father's son, after all." Stubborn and terrified, and too proud to admit you need someone. His voice cracked on the last word, and Isolde crossed the room and put her hand on his back. He flinched, then stilled, then shuddered, a tremor that ran through his whole body like a fault line finally giving way. "She left me this." Isolde pulled the Keats from her coat. "Your mother sent it before she died. She'd arranged with Mrs. Lennox to have it delivered to me." Caspian turned. When he saw the book, his composure shattered. Not dramatically, not with noise. His face simply crumpled, like a building collapsing inward, and he sat down heavily in his chair, pressing the book against his chest with both hands. "This was hers," he whispered. "My father gave it to her. She kept it on her nightstand every single night for 34 years. She gave it to you? She told me to decide with fire." He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw, unguarded, stripped of every wall he'd ever built. No title, no composure, no carefully constructed emptiness. Just a man who had lost his mother and was terrified of losing everything else. "I don't deserve you coming back," he said. "I pushed you away. I called you Miss Marchetti and retreated behind my ledgers and let you walk out when I should have been on my knees, begging you to stay. Yes, you should have. I'm sorry." The words came out ragged. "I'm sorry for being a coward. I'm sorry for hiding behind duty when what I actually felt was terror. You told me my mother wanted fire, and I gave her ashes." Isolde knelt beside his chair, taking his hands. "You were with her at the end. She died knowing you were there. That matters more than anything else. But you weren't there because of me. I'm here now." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, and she felt the wetness of tears on her knuckles. The Duke of Dunmore, who held himself with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, crying silently in a dark study while holding his dead mother's favorite book. Isolde let him grieve. She didn't speak, didn't soothe, didn't try to fix anything. She simply stayed, her hands in his, her presence the only anchor he had. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, but clear, clearer than she'd ever seen them. "I love you," he said, "not as an arrangement, not as a distraction, not as a solution to a problem. I love you because you're the only person who's ever made me want to be present in my own life. Because you told me the truth when everyone else told me what I wanted to hear. Because you bandaged me in a kitchen and demanded 40 acres, and told my mother about your sheep and made her laugh when she'd forgotten how." Isolde's eyes burned. "I love you too. I've been trying to talk myself out of it since the coaching in Thornfield, and it hasn't worked." "Then stop trying." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "Stay. Not as a guest, not as an arrangement. Stay because you want to. Stay because this is real. Your mother's gone. Lady Patience is gone. There's no scheme to maintain anymore. What would I even be staying as? As yourself, as Isolde Marchetti, who runs a farm on the moors and names difficult sheep and doesn't curtsy and isn't afraid to tell a duke he's being a coward to his face. Stay as the woman my mother chose for me before I was brave enough to choose for myself. She kissed him, not carefully, not strategically, not as part of any performance. She kissed him with wind in her hair and the taste of tears between them, and he kissed her back with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd finally stopped drowning. When they pulled apart, Hadrian was standing in the doorway. He was crying and grinning simultaneously, which should have been impossible, but somehow suited him perfectly. Finally, he said, "I was going to give you until tomorrow, and then I was riding to the moors myself to drag her back." Caspian almost smiled. It was small and broken and still edged with grief, but it was real. The first real thing in a very long time. The county talked. Of course they talked. The Duke of Dunmore, barely out of mourning, had dismissed the eminently suitable Lady Patience Gould and was openly courting a farmer's daughter from the moors, a woman with no fortune, no family name, no connections. A woman who kept sheep. Mrs. Gould spread her version of events through every drawing room in Derbyshire. The Duke had been manipulated by an opportunistic country girl who'd exploited his grief. Lady Patience had been wronged. The family reputation was in tatters. Caspian responded by hosting a memorial dinner for his mother 3 weeks after her death and seating Isolde at his right hand. The guest list included every significant family in the county, and the invitation was worded in a way that made attendance feel less optional than obligatory. Isolde wore the midnight blue gown, the one she'd left behind, and Nell had quietly kept, pressing it fresh each week as if she'd known. The memorial was Evadne's design, planned in a letter she'd left with her solicitor to be delivered after her death. The menu she'd chosen, the music she'd selected, the readings she'd assigned, including one for Isolde, the Keats, the same poem her husband had marked in the book he'd given her decades ago. Isolde stood before a room full of strangers who had every reason to dismiss her and read the poem with a steady voice, her accent unhidden, her calloused hands visible on the leather cover, every inch of her exactly who she was. A farmer's daughter reading a dead duchess's favorite poem in a dead duchess's house and making it sound like it belonged. When she finished, the silence held for 3 full heartbeats. Then Hadrian began to clap, slowly, deliberately, his eyes bright. Others followed, reluctantly at first, then with genuine warmth. Not everyone. Mrs. Gould sat rigid as iron. Several older families exchanged disapproving glances. But enough to matter. Caspian stood and crossed to Isolde. In front of every watching eye, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. Then he turned to address the room. My mother's final wish was not what most of you expected. She didn't ask me to uphold tradition or secure an advantageous match or protect the family's standing. She asked me to choose with fire, to be brave enough to want something real, even if it burned. He looked at Isolde, and his expression held everything he'd spent months trying not to feel. Miss Isolde Marchetti saved my life on a night when I crashed through her door, uninvited, bleeding and desperate. She saved it again by refusing to let me hide from my own grief. And she saved it a 3rd time by coming back, when I'd given her every reason not to. He reached into his coat and produced a small box. The whispers erupted like fire through dry grass. I'm not asking because it's proper, or expected, or strategically sound. I'm asking because my mother was right. Love isn't a luxury. It's the only thing that makes any of this bearable. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not the Ashworth family diamond that tradition demanded, but a simple band of gold, set with a single sapphire, the color of the midnight gown she'd worn the night everything changed. Isolde Marchetti. Will you marry me? The room held its breath. Mrs. Gould's face was a mask of fury. Hadrian was gripping the table edge with white knuckles. Mrs. Lennox, standing in the doorway, had abandoned her lifetime of professional neutrality and was openly weeping. Isolde looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the room full of people who would judge her for the rest of her life regardless of her answer. Then she looked at Caspian's eyes, raw and hopeful and terrified, and she saw the man who'd collapsed against her door, the man who'd sat in her kitchen asking for help, the man who'd confessed his heart during a waltz and cried in a dark study, and finally chosen fire. Yes, she said, absolutely, recklessly, completely, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and the room erupted in a complicated mixture of applause and scandal, and one very loud whoop from Hadrian that echoed off the ceiling. 6 months later, Isolde stood in the Ashworth Hall kitchen garden, elbow deep in soil, planting the herbs from her mother's recipe book. The garden had been neglected for years, but she was bringing it back, one bed at a time. The great house was different now, not transformed, not unrecognizable, but softened, lighter. Curtains open, flowers on tables, the smell of baking drifting from the kitchen where Isolde had taught the cook 3 of her mother's recipes and scandalized Mrs. Lennox by kneading bread in the Duchess's morning dress. Hadrian had taken over management of the tenant farms, channeling his restless energy into something productive. He visited Isolde's old cottage regularly, where he'd installed 2 border collies and was attempting to learn sheep management with more enthusiasm than skill. The 40 acres Isolde had bargained for now adjoined the main estate. She ran her own flock there, stubbornly, joyfully, despite Mrs. Gould's well-publicized horror that the Duchess of Dunmore still kept sheep. The society whispers hadn't stopped entirely. They probably never would. But they'd softened from scandal to curiosity to something approaching grudging admiration, helped considerably by Isolde's refusal to pretend to be anything she wasn't. She was pulling a stubborn weed when she felt his shadow fall across her. "You have soil on your face," Caspian said. "I have soil everywhere. It's gardening." He knelt beside her, careless of his trousers, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She noticed he still favored his left side slightly on cold mornings, a ghost of the injury that had brought him to her door. "I found something today," he said. "In Mother's desk. A letter she never sent." He handed her a folded page in Evadne's elegant script. "My dear Caspian, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be angry with me for meddling, which I did extensively, and without apology. But I want you to know that the girl on the moors was never my scheme. She was my hope. The moment she told me about naming difficult sheep, I knew she was the one who could reach you. Not because she's extraordinary, though she is, but because she's real. And you, my darling stubborn son, have been surrounded by performances your entire life. You needed someone who would refuse to perform. Someone with fire in her spine. Be happy. Be present. Be brave. And for God's sake, let her keep the sheep. All my love. Mother." Caspian's eyes were bright. Isolde pressed her forehead against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his shirt, and laughed through her tears. "She planned everything," Isolde said. "She planned nothing. She just knew us both well enough to trust what would happen." They stayed in the garden as the sun moved across the sky, planting herbs and pulling weeds and talking about nothing and everything. The Duke and Duchess of Dunmore, covered in soil, surrounded by sheep, perfectly and completely alive. And on the mantelpiece inside, beside the Keats and the gold-embossed card, sat a small framed watercolor of the moorland cottage where it had all begun, painted by Evadne in her final weeks, when her hands had still been steady enough to hold a brush. She'd titled it in her careful script along the bottom edge, "The Door Where Everything Changed." Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that chooses courage over convenience, in characters who fight for happiness despite the odds, in endings that feel earned and true. Your presence makes this space warm and welcoming, and I'm grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Do you have a favorite line or scene? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what keeps you listening, and what kinds of stories to create next. Consider subscribing if you'd like more stories with emotional depth and genuine character growth. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.